researcher, I am very aware of that. The first time I had a questionnaire given, I used idiomatic conversational English. And I gave it to Filipinos. Guess what? There were certain items or questions that nobody answered. Like, do you feel you are down in the dumps? Do you feel blue? And really, that's why whenever I look at the questionnaire and I see idiomatic expressions, I said, we have to really change it. Because those are nonsensical to us.
Yeah.
How do you say when you say, do you feel blue? I mean, that was in the, when was that? I was in my postdoc.
Yeah, but the thing there is, as professionals, we never learned idiomatic English. We learn academic English from the books, from the lectures at the colleges. And our conversation at home before coming to the United States is in our dialect. So we never got into idiomatic. Now, if you were born here in the United States, there's no problem about that. So you have to be sensitive where this group of people is coming from. Are they immigrants or they're born in the United States? There's totally different perspective. So you have to be very smart and be conscious and considerate about that. And then you turn and pattern questions according to the group of people.
Yeah.
That taught me a great lesson.
Yeah.
The expression I ran into was, they're in the dog house now. And
The
I'm
dog.
going, I don't have a dog.
And I'll put it to what's up, dog. You hear people say what's up, dog. Put it all together.
Now that's the aspect of acculturation. Once you come here, after a few years, you begin to pick up the idioms of America.
Yeah. So I want to talk about this is a good segue to talk about, you know, Americanness. In a lot of ways, we are grateful that we're here. We're able to build our lives. We're able to support our families back home. There's a lot of good things that come from living here in the United States. And in some ways, that history it's a really violent history. So I want to bring that up. But we made do with what we have. We sort of figure out a way to make it big, continue to have community, continue to live our lives, even though the history happened. But I do want to shift gears and talk a little bit about this topic that maybe sometimes comes up in you know, family parties or maybe your conversations. How many of you ever heard this term colonial mentality?
Yes.
What does that mean? What does that mean? What do you think? It's like you know it, but it's like, how do we articulate that? It's like what does it mean? Well, maybe it's better to talk about some examples, because I think when it comes to our health, our physical health, this is a study about health, right? Physical health and mental health, colonial mentality, and I'll talk about how it can come up. It can affect those things. I put up this article. I have a colleague and friend, Agnes Constante, wrote an article about Filipino mental health in the Los Angeles Times. Amazing. We're never in the Los Angeles Times, and she wrote 4 articles about it. I put the QR code, kind of, you know, when you go to the restaurant, you can,
Yes,
if you want to link to the article in case people want to read it, feel free to do that. I'll give it a second. But, you know, Agnes is different. She's more like in the same position as me. She's not an immigrant. She's a daughter of Filipino immigrants. So that's considered second generation. You know, people from the Philippines, you're the first generation. The children are the second generation. The grandchildren are the third generation. But she wanted to talk about colonial mentality, which, there you got it, see? There you go. She wanted to talk about colonial mentality because even though colonialism in the Philippines is technically over, right? 1946, Philippines is independent from the US. even 50 plus years later, the impact of colonialism happens in our everyday lives. Philippines may not be colonized anymore, but the way colonialism has impacted Filipinos' minds, the way they look at the world, it's still there, and it's important to talk about. I'll go back. Did everyone get the QR code? Okay. I have a friend, a psychology professor at University of Alaska named E.J. DeBitt. He wrote this book, Brown Skin, White Minds, about how sometimes, because of colonialism, Filipinos are brown-skinned, but the way they think is kind of like in the way white people think, right? So I know it's hard to define colonial mentality, and that's what he knew too. He's like, everyone talks about this, but what does that actually mean? He thought about different forms of colonial mentality in different arenas. Maybe skin color. What do we always think about skin color? Who do we say is, who's beautiful? Mestiza, light skin, the fair skin.
Professor told me one time,
Yeah.
if you are white skinned or fair skinned, you are already 50% beautiful.
It's there's a word for that. It's called colorism. Colorism. So this is part of colonial mentality, is that we just assume that people who are more light skinned or mestiza, not just that they're more beautiful or more pretty or whatever, but that they're healthier. We assume that they're safer. And then what do we do with people who are dark skinned? What kind of assumptions come up?
They're poor.
They think about economic, like maybe, they're from a different, they're poorer. They think of white, we associate with wealth. Huh?
They're stupid.
They think it can play out in intelligence as well.
Yes.
So, yes.
In other words, you think of them as better than you.
Yes. And I think it's important to name it, because sometimes you can do it without even realizing it. Like if someone, I see this a lot, kids, my cousin will have a baby, and then the baby will be, they'll show the baby to the family, and they'll say, put it, and, they'll say it as like it's a good thing. Like, oh, the baby's so white, that's so nice. But in reality, there's nothing wrong with a baby. The skin color doesn't define whether the baby is lovable or has value, right? But this is part of the colonial mentality, we internalize the idea that white is right. And we have to figure out a way to unlearn that. I want to make sure that I say, even if you've done this before, where everyone in this room has done it, where they see someone who's lighter. And it doesn't even have to be the Filipino community. You can think about, people say this about Beyonce. Oh, Beyonce's so pretty. In the members of Destiny's Child, Beyonce's so pretty because, she has the more Western features, lighter skin than the other members do. So it's all groups in Latin America, you turn on Spanish television, who's going to be in the novellas? Who's going to be on the news anchors? What Mexicans and Latinos? The fair-skinned ones. So this is something that all of us grew up around this environment where we thought lighter is better. But that's part of colonialism. And so the hard part is we sometimes have to, it's almost like we gotta stop ourselves. So we see something, and we see our granddaughter gonna go play, and it's 80 degrees outside, and there's no clouds in the air. We want to say, oh, stay out of the sun. We gotta stop ourselves from saying that, because there's nothing wrong with being out in the sun, except, wearing sunscreen. Yeah, so.
It's so funny when it comes to this, the third generation. Of course, the second generation, they're born here, and they really think American. And then when they get married and have kids, brown and white, I sometimes would look at the pictures and I'd say, where did the brown go?
Disappears, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of, sometimes we think of it like the colonial mentality can play out, not just skin color, but also our beauty standards. Who mentioned the nose? having a particular shaped nose, particular shaped eyes, you know? Language. So, you know, how many of you have been somewhere where someone is like making jokes about the Filipino accent or a Chinese accent or something like that?
It's the other way around though, where I came from, when I first came here.
Yeah.
We went to Tennessee and we encountered the southern drawl. And we couldn't understand them. It's the opposite way. So whenever we pick up the phone when it rings and there's a doctor that asks, you know, in a southern drawl and we couldn't understand them, we tried to pass it to the other one, to the other guy, to the secretary maybe if she's there, but if she's not, we keep on passing the phone because we couldn't understand the doctor because of the southern drawl.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, when that doctor talked again, he would say, for Christ's sake, give me an English-speaking nurse. But this the one that we couldn't understand.
Yeah. And it's,
The southern drawl.
and you know what's funny about when people look down on people because they have an accent? You know what's interesting about that? The people who are complaining or making comments, they only know one language.
Yeah.
Like, they're the ones who are making fun of the people that know 2 or 3 or 4 languages. Isn't that weird? You have double the skills in language, but you're the one that's being discriminated against. That's part of colonial mentality. Making fun of not just the inability to speak English in a particular way, but also accents as well.
Well, and not only making judgments, but taking action. You know, because you know, like when you talk about accents, and you know, my husband was born in North Carolina,
Yeah.
so every once in a while he'll have like a little bit of a southern drawl. Well, there have been people who have treated him like he's stupid because he talks a little bit slower,
Yeah.
or he might, you know, have that like kind of inflection that goes on. And you know, so it's not about skin color in this particular case, but it's about the bias that we hold.
Yes.
And we all have biases.
Yeah. And part of those biases sometimes come from the TV shows you watch or the movies you watch, right? We don't, because they help perpetuate some of these biases. Like my friends, I went to Stanford where a lot of my friends are from Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, and they talked about sometimes they turn off the southern accent in class because people will think they're not as smart because they speak with a southern accent. They'll start speaking like a, you know, typical American English, if you will. But also cultural ways of life, dating and beliefs, dating and relationships. When you have a Filipino that marries someone who's white, they're like, okay, that's fine. But what happens when a Filipino marries someone who's black or Mexican? How many of you ever heard someone make a comment about that? Why? Just that's a colonial mentality thing. It's weird because sometimes let's say they have a Filipino dating a white partner and that white partner treats them poorly, they'll still be seen as a better partner than say like the black or Mexican partner that treats their, you know, wife like a queen. And that's some of the stuff we have to deprogram in our minds. Because in some ways we share a lot of experiences with people who are, you know, black or Mexican. Not the same, but it's similar. Yeah.
I think it could be the opposite, brown skin, white minds. And really, I think some people I've heard of it, the Filipino men have a chip on their shoulder. So it's better for the woman to marry, to be treated better by another group. Only because I remember I had a teacher that says she was really mad, and we were trying to figure out what she was mad about during grade school. She goes, "Oh, look at that. I don't want you girls ever marrying those mamby-pamby little boys on the next, you know, in the next school." And we're wondering, what does mamby-pamby mean? And then we realized she was mad because there's this little boy who has a big backpack, and his maid, who's shorter than him, is carrying his backpack for him. And then we realized, oh, you mean those spoiled little boys from those high-end schools? and you don't want us to be part of that. And that's where they have a chip on their shoulder.
Yeah, I think that's like, again, remember earlier I talked about, oh, sometimes their experience is shaped by like being Filipino, but also we have a lot of identities. We're, you know, man, woman, now we have non-binary, for example. We have different class backgrounds, middle class, working class, upper class. Some of our Filipino loved ones are permanent residents, undocumented, what's the term, TNT, tago na tago, or some are US citizens. You know, there's so many different identities we have, and all those identities affect our experience with the world, always. It's not just being Filipino, it's all of those things combined that affect how you are. But I bring up the colonial mentality thing and those comments because even though you might think like, oh, that's just my preference, or that's just my belief, or that's just a joke. I'm just saying it as a joke, right? It has a real impact on people's experiences. I have a lot of cousins who are women that say, you know, when they don't like going to family parties because people will comment on their weight. They'll say, oh, you gained weight. As if that's also part of, you know, we don't think of that as colonial mentality, but the way we perceive bigger bodies as bad, that's very much a colonial mentality. Because there's some societies where if you have a bigger body, that's a positive thing.
Yes.
It means you're well fed, you're thriving, you know? But in the United States Western culture, they value thinness, and then it affects the way we see people. The model, the way very skinny. So these things, even though we're resilient people, we know how to fight. Even though we are able to, you know, move on or move past some of these experiences. It could be about discrimination. It could be about, you know, a comment that's related to colonial mentality. The fact is that has a real impact on your mental health and your physical health. These days, I want to bring up. I thought this is a little bit unrelated, but I want people to remember this quote. You know, sometimes, like, the reason I bring it up is because I'm thinking of stories where my friends or family have tried to tell their, you know, loved ones, please don't comment on my skin color, or please, like, you know, please don't talk about my weight, or please don't talk about my partner who's not Filipino. Please don't talk about them in a bad way. And then the other person will just fight back. Sometimes we're so focused on who's right and who's wrong, but we gotta remember that it's more important that there was this comedian that said something like, do you want to be right or do you want to be together? And it's always important to remember that sometimes let's not think of right and wrong all the time. And let's think about what do we need to do to move forward together. I think that's an issue that our country is facing right now, is that we've learned a lot of these discriminatory beliefs or colonial mentality beliefs. So we gotta like unlearn it, and we gotta relearn new ways of seeing things. We gotta learn that big is beautiful, black is beautiful, brown is beautiful. We gotta relearn those things because we grew up in a culture that told us the opposite. And that's gonna take time. It takes a lot of time to unlearn things, and it takes a lot of time to relearn things. I think that's something that our country is struggling with has been struggling with. We have social media now. Sometimes it feels like we're so divided in this country. And we had COVID, we had the pandemic. And what happened when the pandemic happened to Filipinos and other Asians? What was happening?
Blame.
Anti-Asian.
Anti-Asian hate. There's a Filipino man in San Francisco. He's on the subway. He's just getting or I don't know if it was New York or San Francisco, but he got his face slashed. a woman that was, going to church, she gets beat up. Here in North Hollywood, there's a Filipino family that's going to McDonald's and they get harassed. There's a Filipino man in Las Vegas in his own garage and he gets beat up.
Yeah.
Insurance.
The whole family. So it's funny because we think, oh wow, we think racism is over, discrimination is over. That stuff that happened to Filipinos, that was 100 years ago. We're in a better place now. But it's important to realize that we have to stay committed to making sure that our community is safe. Because one thing can happen, of COVID-19, and all of a sudden, all of the positive work, all of the great contributions that you made, people forget, and all they see is a threat again. And then it gives them the invitation to viciously attack them. So, and even in Eagle Rock, there was a woman that was riding on the bus on Eagle Rock Boulevard who was actually Mexican, but then they thought she's Filipina. That happens a lot. And then she was attacked, and so there's a lot of things happening, and even if you're not the one that was attacked, or you're not the one that is getting shouted at or being verbally spoken down to or abused, it also causes stress, because when you walk out the door, you're worried, am I going to be the next person that's going to be targeted? And so that's why I think it's these kinds of things like racism, discrimination. We tend to think of health as like, oh, I don't know, I fell down and I broke my foot, or I got a congestion, I have bronchitis. Like, we think of that stuff as like, oh, that's health. Our physical health is affected by viruses, it's affected by injury, it's affected by maybe like our eating habits. One thing we often forget is that our experience as people who are not white also affects our physical and mental health. And that was, for me, that was news to me, because I thought, how could that happen? That doesn't have to do with biology, but it affects you so deeply that the cortisol or the stress that can happen from the fear of being discriminated against, or the fear of feeling like you don't belong, research from everywhere from UCLA to Harvard have shown studies that say if you're experiencing racism, it can affect your health. That happens with Filipinos, that happens with the Black community, that happens with Latino communities. I have a friend in Cal Poly Pomona where I teach. She studies Black women who are giving birth. And she found that Black women that live in communities where there's higher rates of racism, they have poorer health outcomes than Black women that live in places where there's lesser racial and racist incidents. So they don't even have to be the ones targeted, but if it's in the air around them, it can still affect how they feel. I don't want to end on such a downer. I don't want to end on a downer. We are facing a lot of challenges that have to do with not just our personal health and mental health, but also our society. And our instinct is to kind of stay quiet about it, not talk about it. But and that's the natural thing to do. Sometimes when we have a problem, very much a lot of immigrant folks are like, I can figure this out on my own. I can do this on my own. I want to be strong. In fact, a lot of women feel like they have to be strong for the family, for the men, because men are fragile. So men can't take pain. Men are not very good at dealing with the things. Women, on the other hand, are very resilient. But I think sometimes that can be a recipe for staying silent, not talking about things, because it's really hard to talk about vulnerabilities. Oh, I'm feeling weaker today. I feel like my health is not good. It's not easy stuff to talk about. And so I want to just close with this quote from a researcher named Brene Brown. Some of you may have heard of her. She talks about shame and silence a lot. And I'll read. Oh, who wants to read it? Does someone want to read it? Any volunteers? Huh?
Silence.
Okay, I'll read it. It's fine. I'll read it. Okay. So she says, if you put shame in a petri dish, you know those little things you had in science class, science lab, it needs 3 ingredients to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. Secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in the petri dish, but you douse it with empathy, you listen to people, you're open to them, something happens to them and you don't judge them for it, you accept them, what happens to the shame? The shame can't survive. So again, we only had 1 hour with each other, but I hope that there's little tidbits of knowledge, little nuggets of knowledge that, whether it's the history stuff or the colonial mentality stuff or the, the need for community. I want to just close on a positive note and say, this space matters. This couple hours you put into your time here at St. Dominic's Community Center, this is the thing that matters. This is the thing that makes your everyday life better. And studies have shown this is the community is what helps you live longer and live better. So let's keep it up as long as we can.
Yes.
So that's it. Thank you.
That was so wonderful, and as you have mentioned, I think we could probably go on for hours. And Dr. Ocampo, when we were meeting, he and Father Isaiah and I said, well, maybe this is just the beginning. So, if you're open, we may have you come back, and if everybody brings a friend, then we can start to spread this positive, connection, for folks who weren't able to make it today.
Yeah.
But I want to thank you so much for the time and effort that you put in here, and putting your life on the line to drive in the rain from Pomona. And thank you so much. And I'm so glad that your parents came too. So thank you, the services of the Okay.
First of all, I would say you're so brave. Tackle this very difficult and sensitive.
Oh, thank you. You make me cry.
Yeah. What prompted me to think here is the title, Latinos and Asians. I was kind of looking for different from the other Asians, considered Asians. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
So I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can add to that. Maybe I was like, oh, you come here quarterly or something.
Yeah, I didn't hear all of the question because, of course, those of us who are wearing masks.
The book title, I think I have it. A picture of it here. So,
Latinos of Asia.
there.
Yeah.
So,
You can have your book, give it to my kids.
So maybe we can talk about that because it seems like not anybody.
That's the reason why I came here, because I was so intrigued by the title Latinos of Asia.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know, are we different from the other Asian folks?
Okay, thank you for
That's,
asking.
I think that,
Let's hear it.
yeah. So,
And also,
uh-huh.
look at it, in Filipino personality, Asian personality is very different because the Filipinos who are lived in the Philippines were exposed to many, many cultures. We were under Spaniards for 387 years, 332 years. We were under the Japanese. We were under the Americans for 78 years. No.
50 years? Well, we're still kind of far.
We have the influence of the Chinese. We have the influence of the Arabic people. Filipinos are living in the south. But the most number of years are the Latinos. We were trading with Mexico under the galleon trade.
Yeah.
And we imbibe some of the culture of the Spaniards. So that's where your